You're watching Midnight Creed, where every story hides a deep secret and an unexpected twist that will keep you on edge. If you love suspense, mysterious and thrilling tales, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Welcome to Midnight Creed. Let's start the story.
Chapter 1. Fey Snowfall at Alderwood Lodge. Snow had a way of altering one's sense of proportion. Distances seemed longer, sounds more deliberate, and the world itself appeared reduced to essentials: white ground, dark sky, and whatever human purpose had dared to intrude between them. It was into such a world that Hercule, Poirot and I arrived on the afternoon of December the 23rd. Our motor car grinding its last reluctant yards up the narrow drive to Alderwood Lodge. The lodge emerged gradually from the snowfall, first as a darker blur among the pines, then as a solid, rambling structure of stone and timber. Its windows glowed faintly with interior light, the only warmth visible for miles. Snow lay thick upon its roof and window ledges, unbroken and pristine, as though the building itself had been carefully wrapped and set aside for the season. Poirot leaned forward slightly, peering through the glass. "Monday, Emmy," he said, then corrected himself at once. With that precise self-discipline he maintained when speaking English, Hastings observed the snow. I laughed. "It would be difficult not to. We've been driving through it for the better part of 3 hours." "Yes," Poirot replied calmly. "But this snow, look at it closely. It records everything, each step, each hesitation, each return. One cannot move here without leaving a confession behind." I followed his gaze. The grounds surrounding the lodge were untouched. No footprints marred the surface. No wheel tracks beyond our own disturbed the white expanse. The isolation was absolute. "Cheerful place for Christmas," I remarked, rubbing my hands together for warmth, as the driver brought the car to a stop. Poirot smiled faintly. "Christmas, Hastings, is not always cheerful. Sometimes it is merely revealing." We were met at the door by a tall man in a dark coat whose expression balanced efficiency with restraint. He introduced himself as Mr. Linton, the lodge's caretaker, and relieved us of our bags with practiced movements. Inside, the air was immediately warmer, scented with wood smoke and polish. The lodge interior was spacious, but not ostentatious. Heavy beams overhead, thick rugs underfoot, and a large stone fireplace that dominated the main hall. A Christmas tree stood near the hearth, its decorations tasteful rather than exuberant. Everything spoke of money spent carefully, with an eye toward dignity rather than display. "This place was abandoned once," Poirot murmured, glancing about. "You feel it in the walls." Before I could ask what he meant, footsteps approached and a voice cultivated, slightly theatrical, called out in greeting. "Poirot, Captain Hastings, welcome to Alderwood Lodge." Desmond Crowley came toward us with outstretched hand. He was a man in his late 60s, tall, lean, and immaculately dressed. His hair, silvered but abundant, was brushed back neatly. His eyes were sharp, observant, and possessed of a confidence that suggested lifelong command over figures and people alike. Poirot accepted his hand politely. "You honor us, Mr. Crowley." The invitation was most gracious. Crowley smiled. "After all I've done to rebuild this place, it deserves guests who appreciate it." There it was, the note of ownership, not merely of property, but of narrative itself. As Crowley led us further inside, he spoke readily of the lodge's history. Alderwood, it seemed, had once been a fashionable retreat before falling into disuse after a financial scandal decades earlier. It had remained empty and decaying until Crowley purchased and restored it, sparing no expense. "Some people prefer to erase the past," he said lightly. "I prefer to renovate it." Poirot glanced at him. "Renovation does not always remove what lies beneath," he said mildly. Crowley's smile tightened for a fraction of a second, then returned, broader than before. "True enough," he replied, "but it makes it more comfortable." We were introduced one by one to the other guests, assembling in the drawing room, a small gathering carefully curated. There was Margaret Ellison, Crowley's distant cousin, a composed woman with an observant gaze and a voice trained never to betray uncertainty. Beside her sat Julian Hartwell, a writer of historical biographies, whose manner suggested both curiosity and reserve. A younger man, Philip Crowley, Edmund's nephew, stood near the window, gazing out at the snow with an air of restlessness barely concealed. Each greeted us politely. Each, I noticed, glanced briefly toward Edmund Crowley before fully engaging, as though measuring themselves against his presence. Tea was served, and conversation flowed easily enough. Weather, travel difficulties, the inevitability of being snowbound. Yet beneath it all I sensed, as Poirot had earlier suggested, something held back. The lodge was warm, the hospitality impeccable, and yet the isolation pressed inward, reminding us that we were cut off from the ordinary world. As dusk fell, the snowfall intensified. Mr. Linton closed the heavy doors and drew the curtains, sealing us inside. Poirot watched this with interest. "You see, Hastings," he said quietly as we stood near the fire, "a place like this encourages reflection, and reflection, when forced, is rarely comfortable." I glanced around the room again, at Crowley speaking animatedly to his nephew, at Margaret Ellison listening with a faint, knowing smile, at Hartwell observing them all with a writer's careful detachment. "You think something will happen?" I asked. Poirot's expression was thoughtful. "I think," he said slowly, "that isolation does not create danger, it reveals it. And here, with snow that remembers every step and walls that remember every secret, one must tread very carefully indeed." Outside, the snow continued to fall, thick and silent, erasing the last trace of the world, beyond Alderwood Lodge. And within, the Christmas gathering settled in, unaware perhaps that the season of goodwill had chosen this remote retreat for a far colder reckoning. Chapter 2, Fey Footsteps in the Dawn. I have often found that the most dreadful moments arrive, not with thunder, but with something smaller, an ordinary sound made wrong by context. At Alderwood Lodge, it was a scream. It cut through the quiet at first light, sharp enough to wake the whole house, and to make one sit upright with the instant certainty that whatever had been sleeping peacefully in the mind was now irrelevant. The lodge, so warm and composed the night before, seemed to flinch beneath it. Poirot was already awake. When I found him in the corridor, he was fully dressed, his expression calm but attentive, as though the scream had been no more than a bell rung at the proper hour. "We go," he said, and we followed the sound. It led us down the main staircase and through the hall where the Christmas tree still stood, its ornaments catching the grey dawn that seeped through the drawn curtains. Several guests had emerged from their rooms. Margaret Ellison, wrapped in a robe and shawl, her hair pinned back with practiced speed, Philip Crowley in shirt-sleeves, pale and blinking with shock, Julian Hartwell, already in a jacket, his eyes alert behind his spectacles. Mr. Linton, the caretaker, stood near the door in a state of tight, controlled agitation. His face, usually composed, had the strained pallor of a man forced into sudden responsibility. "The maid, Mary," she found him, Linton said in a low voice, as though volume itself might attract calamity. "In the courtyard." Philip pushed forward. "Found who?" he demanded, though the answer was already shaping itself in his expression. Linton swallowed. "Mr. Crowley." A silence fell, not absolute, because a house is never truly silent, but heavy enough to bend the air. Even the fire in the grate seemed to crackle more quietly. Poirot moved to the door. "Open," he said. Linton hesitated. Only for an instant, then unlatched it. Cold rushed in like a living thing, sharp and immediate, carrying the clean, unforgiving scent of snow. We stepped out into a world that looked transformed. Overnight, the snowfall had deepened. The courtyard, enclosed on three sides by the lodge's stone walls, lay under a flawless sheet of white, undisturbed except for one stark line of footprints leading from the doorway straight across to the far side. At the end of that line lay Edmund Crowley. He was on his back beneath the open sky, his coat splayed as if he had fallen suddenly. A thin crust of ice had begun to form along his collar and hairline, making his silver hair look like it had been dusted with glass. His face, turned slightly to one side, was rigid with cold. In the weak dawn light, it had the unnatural stillness of a statue. Yet, the angle of his jaw, and the frozen tension around his mouth suggested that death had not been gentle. Mary the maid stood a little distance away, hands clasped to her mouth, sobbing silently in bursts. Her apron was crumpled, her cheeks raw from crying. "He was there," she whispered when Hawthorne— No, not Hawthorne. I corrected myself. There was no inspector here yet, only frightened people, when Linton tried to ask her what she had seen. I opened the curtains, and I looked out, and he was just there. Philip Crowley staggered forward, then stopped as if an invisible barrier had been placed between him and his uncle. This can't be," he began, and could not finish. Julian Hartwell's gaze went not to the body, but to the footprints. His writer's mind, I thought, had seized upon the starkness of the image as though it were a scene in a book. Margaret Ellison drew her shawl tighter. She did not cry out. Her eyes remained fixed, her expression controlled, but I saw the tiny pulse beating at her throat. Poirot did not hurry to the body. He went first to the footprints. They were clear and deep in the fresh snow. The impression of boots, spaced evenly, suggesting a steady pace rather than a run. They began at the threshold of the lodge door, crossed the courtyard in a direct line, and ended at Crowley's feet. And there they stopped, beyond the body. The snow was untouched. Around it, too, there were no return tracks, no scuffs, no erased signs of movement. The line of footprints might have been drawn by a ruler. Uncompromising. Poirot crouched slightly, leaning close. He did not touch. He observed. "The snow," he murmured, more to himself than to any of us, "remembers what people wish to forget." Linton's voice cracked. "What does that mean?" Poirot looked up at him. "It means, Mr. Linton, that someone left the lodge, someone walked to Mr. Crowley, and no one walked back." Philip's voice rose, raw with panic. Then he walked out himself and— "What died there?" Poirot's gaze returned to the body. "Perhaps," Hartwell spoke for the first time, his tone careful, "or someone carried him back." "Carried?" Philip snapped, incredulous. Margaret Ellison answered quietly. "If he was killed elsewhere." Poirot's eyes flicked to her. "You consider that possibility quickly, Madame Ellison." Her face did not change, because the footprints do not make sense. Poirot gave a faint nod, as though approving the plainness of her mind. Then he rose and approached the body at last. He knelt beside Crowley, his movements precise. He examined the man's hands first, noting how the fingers were slightly curled. Then he studied Crowley's face. The skin had already taken on that waxen pallor that belongs to death in cold air. Poirot glanced up at me. "Do you smell anything, Hastings?" I sniffed the air. All I could smell was snow and the faint distant smoke from the lodge chimney. "No," I said. Poirot's eyes returned to Crowley's coat. He brushed at it lightly with the edge of his glove. A fine dust of ice crystals lifted. "Not here," he said softly. "Nothing obvious." Mary made a choked sound. "Is he?" Poirot looked toward her, and his voice, though gentle, left no hope. "Yes, he is dead." Philip swore and turned away, pressing his hands to his face. Hartwell remained still, his gaze fixed on Poirot's hands, as though he expected a magician's trick. Margaret Ellison's eyes closed briefly, one controlled blink that might have been prayer or calculation. Poirot stood and returned again to the footprints. He walked along them slowly without stepping into them, tracing their line with his eyes. At the door he paused and looked up at the stone archway and the heavy latch. "Who locked the door last night?" he asked. Linton swallowed. "I did." "At what time?" "Just after 11. Everyone had retired. Mr. Crowley went up. He was tired. He said good night." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Did anyone leave after you locked it?" "Number not that I know." Poirot pointed with a slight motion of his hand. "And yet, this morning, the door was unlocked." Linton's face tightened. "Mary came down early to draw curtains. She would have needed to unlatch it if she went out." Mary nodded frantically. "Ah, yes. Because I saw him and I ran out, I didn't think." Poirot regarded her kindly. "You did not make these footprints, Mary. Your steps would be smaller, and you would have made prints beside them as you approached. Mary shook, helpless. Then whose are they? Poirot did not answer her directly, he asked. Instead, where is the key kept? In the office, Linton said. But the door latch can be opened from inside. The key is for outside access. Poirot's eyes moved to the snow piled at the base of the door. It lay thick and even except where the footprints began. He crouched and examined the threshold closely. The first print, he said, begins not at the edge, but a little forward. See, as though the person stepped out carefully, but with weight. Hartwell leaned in. What does that imply? That the person was not rushing, Poirot replied. They had time. Philip's voice, strained, came from behind us. This is mad. You think someone murdered him and left him out here, like a display? Poirot glanced at the body again. It is possible. He lies beneath the open sky as though placed for discovery. Margaret's voice remained level. Why place him here? Poirot's eyes returned to the footprints. Because the snow is honest. It tells a story, and a murderer who believes he can control the story may choose a stage where the evidence seems clear. He stood and looked across the courtyard. The footprints were so direct, so singular, that they offered the mind one obvious conclusion. Crowley had walked out alone and died where he fell. And yet, Poirot said softly, stories that are too neat are often lies. Linton spoke tensely. We must send for the police. Yes, Poirot said. At once. Linton turned to a footman. Get the telephone line. If the storm hasn't, try the village. Now. The footman hurried inside. Poirot continued to study the snow. He moved to the side where the lodge wall met a bank of drifted snow. He examined it, then the narrow path leading to the side gate. It was covered, untouched. No one had left the courtyard that way. He returned to the footprints and followed them again, stopping at the end by Crowley's feet. He stared at the last impressions for a long moment. Hastings, he said quietly, come here. I stepped nearer, Poirot pointed. Observe the depth of the prints near the body. They were deeper than those near the door, not dramatically but noticeably. The person slowed, Poirot murmured, or carried weight, or stood for a moment. He straightened, and his eyes lifted to the windows of the lodge. Dark squares above us. Several curtains had been drawn back now, and faces peered out. The lodge itself was watching, like a silent witness. Poirot's voice, when he spoke again, was barely above the whisper of falling snow. In a place like this, he said, one thinks isolation protects. But isolation does something else. It concentrates. Concentrates what? I asked. He did not answer at once. He looked at Edmund Crowley, wealthy benefactor, proud restorer of a lodge with an abandoned past, lying rigid in the snow as though the winter had claimed him personally. At night, Poirot said finally, there are no crowds to hide in, no passing strangers to blame, only those under this roof. A gust of wind swept the courtyard, lifting a fine veil of snow and sending it swirling across the footprints, like a hand trying to erase them. Poirot watched that swirl, his eyes narrowing. Snow remembers, he murmured again, but it can be made to forget, if someone is clever. He turned toward the lodge door. And someone here, he said softly, is very clever indeed. Chapter 3. The locked lodge Inspector Mallory arrived shortly after 9, accompanied by 2 constables who looked distinctly resentful of the snow that clung to their boots and greatcoats. He was a solidly built man in his early 50s, with a square jaw, steady eyes, and the air of one who preferred facts to speculation. The storm had delayed him, but it had not softened him. By the time he entered the lodge, the household had settled into a strained orderliness. Fires burned, tea was served untouched, and voices were kept deliberately low, as though sound itself might disturb the dead. Mallory listened first without interruption. Mr. Linton explained the discovery. Mary repeated her account through trembling lips. Philip Crowley interjected twice and was curtly silenced. Margaret Ellison spoke clearly and briefly. Julian Hartwell offered observations rather than emotions, which Mallory noted with interest, but did not comment upon. Only Poirot said nothing at all. When the inspector had heard enough, he pulled on his gloves again. "Take me to him," he said. The courtyard looked even colder in full daylight. The snow reflected the pale sky, making the world appear drained of color. Edmund Crowley lay exactly where we had left him, a constable standing watch, a few yards away. Mallory crouched, examining the body with professional efficiency. He did not linger on Crowley's face, but studied the posture, the clothing, the ground beneath. "No sign of a struggle," he said at last. "No defensive wounds, no blood in the snow." "That is correct," Poirot said mildly. Mallory glanced at him. "You are Hercule Poirot?" Mallory nodded once. "I know the name. You've been busy already, I hear." "I have been observant," Poirot replied. "That is not quite the same thing." Mallory returned his attention to the body. "Cause of death appears to be exposure. Night temperatures dropped well below freezing." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "But exposure alone is rarely so tidy." Mallory lifted an eyebrow. "You see something I don't." Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the footprints. "They tell a story," Mallory said. "One set, from door to body, none back. Simple." "Too simple," Poirot replied. Mallory straightened slowly. "Go on." Poirot knelt beside Crowley's head and indicated the base of the neck, just above the collar line. "Here," he said. Mallory leaned in, peering closely. There, just visible beneath the stiffened skin, was a faint discoloration, small, precise, easily overlooked. "A bruise," Mallory said. "Yes," Poirot replied, "and not from a fall." Mallory rose to his feet. "You're saying he was rendered unconscious?" "Or stunned," Poirot said. "Enough that he could not save himself." Mallory exhaled slowly, which means he didn't simply wander out here and collapse. "Exactly." Mallory looked around the courtyard again, this time with less confidence in the obvious. "Then where did it happen?" Poirot's gaze moved to the lodge itself, inside. They returned indoors, stamping snow from their boots. Mallory wasted no time. "Now," he said, addressing the assembled guests, "I will be very clear. Mr. Crowley did not die by accident. He was incapacitated first, then left outside to freeze." A collective intake of breath followed. Philip Crowley surged forward. "You're accusing." "I am stating facts," Mallory cut in, "which means someone here assaulted him." Silence fell heavily. Mallory continued. "The storm makes it impossible for anyone to have left the grounds overnight. The snow shows no additional tracks. The side paths are blocked. No vehicle could approach or depart." "And the door?" Margaret Ellison asked quietly. "Bolted from the inside when we arrived," Mallory said, "which presents a problem." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "A locked lodge." Mallory frowned. "Unless Crowley went out himself and someone locked it after." Poirot shook his head. "That would require a return inside. There are no footprints." Mallory considered this, unless the snow covered them. Poirot's eyes were steady. The snowfall was light in the early hours. Not enough to erase such evidence completely. The snow remembers. Mallory studied him for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Then someone must have exited with him and returned without leaving tracks," Poirot said. Mallory's mouth tightened. "Which is impossible." "Unless," Poirot said gently, "they did not walk." A pause. Hartwell spoke cautiously. "You mean he was carried?" "Perhaps part of the way," Poirot said. "Or supported, or guided while unconscious." Mallory rubbed his chin. "Still leaves the problem of the door." Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed." He moved toward the main hall and examined the heavy door closely. The bolts, the hinges, the latch. He crouched, studying the floor near the threshold. "There," he said. Mallory followed his gaze. Near the base of the door, partially obscured by melted snow and tracked, in moisture, was a faint scuff mark, irregular, not matching a shoe sole. "Furniture," Mallory suggested. "No," Poirot replied. "Something heavy. Something dragged briefly. Mallory straightened sharply. You think he was moved on something? Yes, Poirot said, and the snow outside was meant to finish what had already begun. Mallory turned back to the group. Which means, he said grimly, that one of you struck Edmund Crowley, incapacitated him, took him outside, locked the door behind you, or had it locked and left him to die. Philip Crowley's face had gone grey. Margaret Ellison sat very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Hartwell adjusted his spectacles with a hand that was not quite steady. And the bruise, Mallory continued, came before the cold. Poirot nodded, which means intent. Mallory met Poirot's eyes. This is no accident, it's murder. Outside, the snow continued to fall lightly, adding layer upon layer to the courtyard, softening the scene, disguising it. But inside Alderwood Lodge, the truth had begun to press inward. The lodge was locked, the storm had sealed it. And within its walls, someone had turned winter itself into a weapon. Chapter 4 Fey guests, with cold motives. If the lodge itself had seemed colder after Inspector Mallory's pronouncement, the chill deepened still further when questioning began in earnest. Motive, once introduced, has a way of seeping into every corner of a house, coating words and glances alike with suspicion. Alderwood Lodge, sealed by snow and circumstance, became a place where no grievance could be dismissed as trivial. Inspector Mallory chose the drawing room for the interviews. The fire burned there, but it did little to soften the air. Poirot sat slightly apart, hands folded, eyes alert. He did not lead the questioning. Instead, he watched how each person answered, and, more importantly, how they listened when others spoke. The first to be questioned was Edmund Crowley's nephew, Lucas Crowley, who had introduced himself the night before as Philip, a familiar diminutive his uncle preferred, stood by the mantelpiece, his face tight with a mixture of anger and grief. He was a man in his early 30s, well-dressed but careless in bearing, as though money had always been near enough that he need not chase it. "You argued with your uncle last night," Mallory said without preamble. Lucas's jaw clenched. "Yes, I did." "About what?" "Inheritance," Lucas said bluntly. "There's no point pretending otherwise." Margaret Ellison's head turned slightly, her expression unreadable. Lucas went on, his voice gaining force as though relieved to speak. He kept everything dangling. Promises, hints, always reminding me that nothing was guaranteed. Last night, he said. He broke off, swallowing. He said I should be grateful for allowances, not expect legacies. "You raised your voice?" Mallory asked. "Yes." "Threaten him?" Lucas let out a harsh laugh. "Number, I accused him of enjoying control, of using money to keep people obedient." Poirot's eyes flicked to Margaret Ellison, then back. "And after the argument?" Mallory continued. "He went upstairs." Lucas said, "I stayed by the fire with a drink. Hartwell was there. So was my cousin." Margaret Ellison spoke calmly. "That is correct." Mallory nodded. "You did not leave the room again?" "No," Lucas said quickly. "Not until this morning." Poirot spoke at last, his tone gentle. "Monsieur Crowley, did your uncle threaten you in return?" Lucas hesitated. He said, "that I would regret impatience." Poirot inclined his head. "Thank you." Lucas sank into a chair, his anger spent, replaced by a bleak weariness. The motive was clear enough. Money, expectation, resentment, but Poirot's gaze lingered only a moment before moving on. "Caretaker," Mallory said. "Mr. Price." Samuel Price stepped forward reluctantly. He was a broad man with hands roughened by years of manual work, his face lined more by weather than by age. Unlike the others, he did not look at Crowley's chair or the empty space where his employer should have been. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. "You were responsible for reopening the lodge," Mallory said. "Yes." "Against your better judgment." Price's shoulders tensed. "I told him it wasn't ready." "Why?" "The foundations in the west wing old damage water got in years ago. I said it needed another year, at least, before winter guests." He lifted his head, anger flaring. "He told me to stop exaggerating, said he'd rebuilt better than before. "And you resented this?" Mallory said. "I resented being blamed when things went wrong," Price replied. He made it clear. "Any failure would be on me." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Monsieur Price, did you fear for your safety or for others?" Price hesitated. "Both." "Did you argue with Mr. Crowley last night?" "Yes." "What time late? After dinner?" "In the hall." "Was anyone present?" Mallory asked. Price nodded toward Hartwell. "The writer. He passed through." Hartwell acknowledged this with a brief nod. "And afterward?" Mallory pressed. "I went to my room," Price said. "I was tired, angry, but I went." Poirot's eyes searched his face. "Anger makes men careless," he said quietly. "But you are not careless, are you, Mr. Price?" Price met his gaze steadily. Number Mallory dismissed him with a nod. The third interview shifted the atmosphere subtly. Helen Morris entered the room with quiet efficiency. Her posture straight, her movements controlled. She wore a dark dress and sensible shoes, her hair neatly arranged. She looked, I thought, exactly as one would expect a professional nurse to look, capable, composed, and accustomed to managing other people's distress. "You were engaged as Mr. Crowley's nurse?" Mallory asked. "Yes, part-time. I assisted with his medication and general care." "And he planned to reduce your pay," Mallory continued. Helen did not deny it. "After the holidays, he told me 2 days ago." "Did he give a reason?" "He said the expense was unnecessary, that I was too attentive." Her mouth tightened briefly. "He preferred economy to comfort." Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. "And this angered you?" "It concerned me," she replied carefully. "But anger, number employment changes." Mallory's tone sharpened. "He intended to dismiss you?" "Yes. And you were alone with him at times." "Of course. That was my role." Poirot spoke again softly. "Madame Morris, are you familiar with the effects of cold on the human body?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "And with rendering someone unconscious?" Her eyes flicked toward him, sharp now. "In a medical context?" "Yes." Mallory leaned forward. "Where were you last night after 11? "In my room." "Agnon to confirm." Number Poirot watched her hands. They were steady, too steady, perhaps. But then, she was trained for steadiness. When Helen Morris was dismissed, the drawing room felt markedly smaller. Mallory leaned back, exhaling. "3 strong motives," he said. "Money, safety, livelihood." "And yet," Poirot said quietly, "the snow still speaks the loudest." Mallory frowned. "You're fixed on those footprints." "Yes. They show one person leaving," Mallory said. "No return." "And therefore," Poirot replied, "they show intention." He stood and moved toward the window, looking out into the courtyard where fresh snow continued to fall, softening edges but not erasing truth. "Each of these people had reason to wish Edmund Crowley harm," Poirot said. "But wishing is not doing. What matters is who could arrange this scene." Mallory folded his arms. "Go on." "The bruise was applied before exposure. The victim was incapacitated indoors. He was then brought outside carefully. The door was bolted. The footprints were allowed to remain." "You think they were staged?" Mallory said slowly. "Yes," Poirot replied, "because they are too clear, too singular. The murderer wanted us to see them, to accept the story they tell. And that story is that Edmund Crowley walked out alone and died," Poirot said. "An unfortunate decision, a tragic exposure." Mallory nodded grimly. "But the truth contradicts it." "Yes, and that contradiction points not to rage, but to planning." He turned back to the group, his gaze sweeping them once more. "Cold motives," Poirot said softly, "produce cold crimes." The fire crackled, a small, defiant sound. Outside, the courtyard lay silent beneath its white coverlet, the footprints still visible, despite the falling snow. They were the loudest clue of all, and Poirot, I knew, had begun to hear what they were truly saying. Chapter 5. Fay the deceptive snow. The courtyard lay quieter than before, as though the lodge itself had absorbed the shock of death and settled into a watchful stillness. Snow continued to fall, but lightly now, almost respectfully, adding only the thinnest veil to what had already been written upon its surface. Poirot asked Inspector Mallory for permission to examine the courtyard again, alone if possible. Mallory hesitated only briefly. By now, Poirot's calm certainty had begun to exert its own authority. "Very well," he said. "But I want to know what you see." Poirot inclined his head. "You shall." I accompanied him out into the cold, careful to keep to the edges of the courtyard, where the snow was already disturbed. The body had been removed an hour earlier, carried with solemn care back into the lodge, yet its absence only sharpened the clarity of what remained. The footprints still ran from the door to the place where Edmund Crowley had lain, clean, unmistakable, and apparently honest. Poirot did not begin at the door. Instead, he walked slowly along the line of prints, crouching now and then, holding a small ruler from his pocket, measuring distances with meticulous attention. "Observe, Hastings," he said quietly, "the spacing." I looked more closely. At first glance, the prints seemed evenly spaced, each step similar to the last, but under Poirot's guidance, differences emerged. "Here," he said, pointing, "and here." The distance between the prints shortened slightly as they neared the far end of the courtyard. He slowed. I said. "Yes," Poirot agreed, "but not as one who hesitates, as one who weakens." He moved farther along the trail. Now the depth. Near the door. The impressions were firm and deep. Farther on, they grew gradually lighter, less defined, as though the weight pressing down upon the snow had diminished. "He was losing strength," I said. Poirot nodded. "Or appearing to." I frowned. Appearing, Poirot straightened slightly, his breath visible in the cold air. "If a man is growing weaker, Hastings, his steps do not become merely lighter. They become irregular. He stumbles, he veers." He gestured along the line. "These do not." I followed the trail with my eyes again. Poirot was right. The prints, though shallower, remained straight, deliberate, controlled. "So," I said slowly, "someone wanted it to look as though he was fading." "Yes," Poirot said, as though exposure alone defeated him. He returned to the doorway now, kneeling carefully near the threshold. The snow was oddly different. Not deeper, not piled, but smoothed. Poirot brushed it lightly with his gloved hand. "Here," he said. "Do you see?" At first I did not. Then I noticed that the snow closest to the door lacked the soft granularity of fresh fall. It was compressed, faintly glossy, almost polished. "Ice," I said. "Yes," Poirot replied. "Scraped, not fallen." "From boots," I suggested. "Number boots leave pattern. This is erased." He leaned closer, examining the stone threshold and the snow beyond it. Something hard was drawn across this area, repeatedly, carefully. "To hide footprints," I said. "Yes, or to alter them." Poirot stood and looked back along the courtyard, imagining the scene as it must have unfolded. "Someone took great care here," he murmured. "They did not rely on chance snowfall. They shaped what we would see." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "That takes time." "Yes," Poirot said, "and confidence, the confidence that no one would interrupt." "Which suggests the murderer knew the house would be asleep," I said. Poirot nodded, or drugged, or reassured. He examined the door itself again, the heavy bolt, the iron fittings. "This door," he said, "is an accomplice. It locks from the inside, which means the killer returned, or never left." "But the footprints," I began. He moved a few paces away and crouched again, examining the shallowest prints near where Crowley's body had lain. "These," he said, "are almost impressions rather than steps pressed down. Not walked into." "Pressed," I repeated. "Yes, as one presses a stamp." I stared. "You mean—" "Yes," Poirot said, A deliberate imprint, not the weight of a man walking freely. I straightened slowly. Then Crowley didn't walk out here at all. No, Poirot said softly. He was brought. And the weakening footprints. We're staged, Poirot replied, to tell a story of gradual collapse. A gust of wind swept across the courtyard, lifting loose snow and scattering it in small, swirling patterns. Poirot watched it, thoughtfully. Snow is honest, he said. But it is also obedient. It accepts what is pressed upon it. We stood in silence for a moment, the implications settling between us. The bruise, I said at last. He was incapacitated inside, then carried or supported out here. Someone made the prints afterward. Yes, Poirot said, and did so with care, lightening their pressure as they went. A patient hand, a thoughtful mind. And the smoothed ice by the door, I asked. Evidence of rehearsal, Poirot said. Of correction. The killer noticed something amiss and fixed it. We turned back toward the lodge. The windows stared down at us, blind and reflective. Only someone who felt safe here would take such time, I said. Poirot nodded. Safe or entitled. We re-entered the lodge, stamping snow from our boots. Inside, warmth rushed back at once, but it no longer comforted. The corridors seemed narrower now, the ceilings lower, the air thick with unspoken calculation. Inspector Mallory awaited us near the fire. Well? He asked. Poirot met his gaze steadily. The footprints lie. Mallory's jaw tightened. Explain, Poirot spoke calmly, laying out the observations, the diminishing depth, the unnatural regularity, the smoothed ice near the door. This scene was manipulated, Poirot concluded, with patience and foresight. Mallory exhaled slowly. So the snow was used as evidence. Yes, Poirot said, because everyone believes snow tells the truth. Mallory stared into the fire. Then we're dealing with someone meticulous. Yes, Poirot agreed, someone who believes appearances can be engineered. Mallory looked up. Who here fits that? Poirot's gaze drifted briefly toward the corridor, leading to the upper rooms, then back. Several, he said, but only one has both the calm and the habit. Outside, the snowfall thickened slightly, continuing its quiet work of concealment. But Poirot had already seen what lay beneath, and now so had I. Chapter 6, Faya Room 2. Warm. Crowley's bedroom lay at the end of the upper corridor, its door closed but not locked. When Inspector Mallory opened it, a wave of warmth met us so abruptly that it felt almost indecent after the bitter cold of the courtyard. Poirot paused on the threshold. Ah, he said softly. That is interesting. The room itself was large and handsomely furnished, dominated by a heavy bed draped in dark wool and a tall stone fireplace set into the far wall. The fire was no longer burning, but the hearth still radiated heat, and the scent of recently consumed logs hung faintly in the air. Mallory frowned. The fire was lit last night. Yes, Mr. Linton said at once. Mr. Crowley liked the room warm. He complained of the cold. Poirot nodded politely, but did not comment. Instead, he moved slowly about the room, absorbing its details. A chair pulled slightly away from the desk, a glass on the bedside table, empty but faintly clouded at the bottom. Curtains drawn tight, as though to keep the night at bay. May I? Poirot asked, gesturing toward the fireplace. Mallory inclined his head. Poirot crouched and examined the hearth closely. The ashes were pale and fine, disturbed only once, as though the fire had been allowed to die naturally, rather than stirred repeatedly. He held his hand just above the stone. Still warm, he murmured. This fire was used late. Lucas Crowley, who had followed us into the room with visible reluctance, shifted his weight. That proves nothing, he said sharply. My uncle always slept with a fire in winter. Poirot glanced at him. Indeed, but tonight, Monsieur Crowley, it proves something else as well. Lucas opened his mouth to retort, then closed it again. Poirot moved toward a folding screen near the corner of the room. It stood at an angle that suggested it had been adjusted recently. He looked at it for a moment, then reached out and pushed it aside. Behind it stood a pair of boots. They were heavy outdoor boots, well made, now placed close to the warmth of the fire. Their leather was darkened with moisture. Meltwater pooled slightly beneath them, seeping into the rug. Mallory's expression hardened. Those weren't here earlier. No. Poirot agreed. They were hidden. He knelt and examined them carefully, lifting one with care. Snow still clung to the grooves of the sole, packed tightly in the pattern. Poirot looked up. This snow, he said quietly, is the same snow as the courtyard. Lucas's face flushed. They're mine, he said abruptly. My boots. I came in late. I didn't want them dripping all over the hall. Mallory turned on him. You didn't mention going outside. I stepped out briefly, Lucas said, for air. In the middle of the night, Mallory said flatly, during a storm. Lucas's eyes darted. I couldn't sleep. Poirot did not challenge him directly. He studied the boots instead, his fingers tracing the sole pattern with almost affectionate care. Tell me, Monsieur Crowley, he said gently, you wear these often? Yes. And last night? Yes. Poirot nodded. They are damp from recent use. That is clear, and they were dried secretly. Lucas bristled. Secretly. Poirot raised a hand, silencing him without effort. But, he continued calmly, they do not tell the same story as the snow. Mallory frowned. What do you mean? Poirot rose and turned toward the inspector. The stride in the courtyard. The spacing of the prints is longer than these boots would suggest. Lucas stared. That's ridiculous. Poirot shook his head. Not at all. Stride is habit. It belongs to the body. A shorter man may hurry, may lengthen his step, but habit remains. He looked directly at Lucas now. Your stride is shorter, more abrupt. These boots would leave prints closer together. Lucas's mouth opened, then closed again. Mallory's voice was sharp, so the boots were worn, but not to make those footprints. Yes, Poirot said. They were worn, perhaps to go outside briefly, perhaps to assist, but not to create the line we saw. Lucas laughed, high and strained. So what? You think I was involved, but not that involved. Poirot's gaze was steady. I think you are hiding something, but not the right thing. Silence fell thickly in the warm room, broken only by the faint crackle of cooling embers. Poirot turned back to the fireplace. This room was used after Mr. Crowley was incapacitated, he said. Someone came here. Someone warmed themselves. Someone dried boots. Mallory nodded slowly, which means someone returned inside after taking him out. Yes, Poirot replied, and locked the door behind them. Lucas shook his head helplessly. You're twisting everything. Poirot regarded him with quiet sympathy. Monsieur Crowley, you are frightened. You quarreled with your uncle. You stepped outside. You hid that fact. But fear is not the same as guilt. Lucas sagged slightly, as though the fight had gone out of him. I didn't kill him, he said hoarsely. I believe you, Poirot said. Mallory studied Poirot. Then why hide the boots? Poirot answered for Lucas. Because Monsieur Crowley feared suspicion, and because he knows something he has not yet said. Lucas looked away. Poirot bent once more and lifted the boots, holding them toward the light. These, he said, are a distraction placed here to be found, or nearly forgotten, but they do not fit the crime. Mallory folded his arms. Then whose boots made the footprints? Poirot replaced the boots carefully and straightened. His eyes moved around the room once more, taking in the warmth, the order, the care with which everything had been maintained. Someone, he said softly, who is comfortable here, someone who knows this house, someone who had the patience to manipulate snow and the foresight to dry their own tracks. Mallory's expression darkened. You're narrowing it. Yes, Poirot agreed. And soon, Inspector, there will be nowhere left for the truth to hide. The fire gave one last soft crack as a log shifted inward, collapsing into ash, and in that unnaturally warm room, amid drying boots and dying embers, I felt the walls of Alderwood Lodge close in just a little tighter around its remaining guests. Chapter 7 Fay. The caretaker's shortcut. The revelation came, as such things often do, not from cleverness but from fatigue. Samuel Price had been silent for most of the morning, answering questions when asked, and otherwise keeping to the edges of the lodge like a man who believed that stillness might render him invisible. It was only when Inspector Mallory, growing impatient, remarked aloud that the courtyard offered no honest way back, that Price stirred. "There is one," he said. Every head turned. Price stood near the doorway, his cap clutched in both hands. He did not look at Poirot when he spoke. His eyes were fixed on a knot in the wooden floor. "There's a way across the courtyard without leaving footprints," he said quietly. Mallory straightened. "Explain." Price exhaled, slowly as though he had been holding the words back for some time. "When we were rebuilding the lodge, we used planks, long ones for hauling stone, timber in winter. Before the paths were cleared, I'd lay them down across the snow, walk across, lift them behind me." Poirot's eyes sharpened at once. "Where are these planks now?" Mallory demanded. "Stored under the west wing," Price replied, "beneath the raised section, easy to slide out." Mallory gestured sharply. "Show us." We followed Price through a side corridor and down a narrow service stair that led beneath the lodge. The air grew colder and damper. Beneath the raised stonework of the west wing lay a shallow storage space, half hidden by stacked firewood and old tools. Price bent, pulled free 2 long wooden planks, and slid them into the light. They were weathered but solid, each wide enough for careful footing. Their upper surfaces were dry and smooth, almost too smooth. While the undersides were darkened with damp, the wood swollen slightly from contact with snow. Poirot crouched immediately, running his fingers along the edge. "Recently used," he murmured. Mallory frowned. "Wiped clean." "Yes," Poirot said, "but not dried." Price shifted uncomfortably. When I realized what you were thinking, I cleaned them. I didn't want." "You didn't want suspicion," Mallory finished grimly. Price nodded. "I knew how it would look." Poirot rose slowly. "Tell me, Mr. Price, did you use these planks last night?" Price hesitated. Then he nodded once. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the small group that had gathered. Lucas Crowley, pale and watchful. Helen Morris, composed but alert. Margaret Ellison, her gaze intent. Mallory's voice was sharp. "When late," Price said. "After midnight." "And why?" Mallory demanded. Price's jaw tightened. "I heard something. A noise, thought it might be the foundations. Shifting, I went to check the west wing exterior." Poirot tilted his head. "And you did not wish to leave footprints?" "No," Price said. "Snow was deep. I didn't want to track it in." Mallory crossed his arms. "Did you see Mr. Crowley? Numbered. Did you encounter anyone else?" Price shook his head. Poirot was silent for a moment, studying the planks, the damp underside, the careful cleaning. Then he spoke, very quietly. "These planks," he said, "would leave no footprints at all." Price blinked. "That's the point." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "And that is precisely the problem." Mallory frowned. "You're saying—" "I am saying," Poirot continued gently, "that if Mr. Crowley had been taken across the courtyard on these planks, there would be no trail, no single line of footprints, no story of a man walking alone into the cold." He looked toward the courtyard door above us, as though seeing the snow through stone and timber. "And yet," Poirot said, "there was a trail, clear, unambiguous, too unambiguous." Price's face tightened with confusion. "So the planks weren't used?" "Oh, they were used," Poirot said, "but not in the way you imagine." Mallory stared at him. "Then how?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet intensity. "The truth, Inspector, lies somewhere between presence and absence." He gestured lightly with one hand, as though sketching an invisible diagram in the air. "Consider," he said. "Someone wishes to move a body across the courtyard. They know the snow will betray them, so they use planks. Yes, to carry or support the victim, avoiding footprints. That accounts for the absence." He paused. "But afterward," he continued, "they create a presence. They walk alone, pressing footprints into the snow. Carefully, patiently, lightening pressure as they go. They tell a story. Mallory's eyes widen slightly. You're saying the footprints were added after? Yes, Poirot replied. Not as evidence of movement, but as evidence of narrative. Price stared at the planks in his hands as though seeing them for the first time. Then, Summonen used my shortcut to avoid tracks, and then made tracks. Exactly, Poirot said. And that requires two things, knowledge of the planks, and the confidence to linger afterward. Mallory's gaze snapped back to Price. Who else knew about these? Price swallowed. Mr. Crowley did, and he hesitated. Agnon, who worked here closely, maintenance care. Helen Morris's eyes flicked toward Poirot. Margaret Ellison spoke quietly. The planks would not support someone alone easily. Poirot nodded approvingly. Indeed, it would require balance, strength or assistance. Mallory rubbed his chin, which suggests more than one person, or one very capable one. Poirot shook his head gently. Not necessarily more than one person acting, but more than one role. Mallory looked at him sharply. Explain. The same person, Poirot said, may prepare and perform, but preparation requires privacy. Performance requires visibility. He glanced back toward the planks. Mr. Price, you used these late last night. You cleaned them. Why? Because I realized, when the body was found, that someone might think it was me. Poirot nodded. Fear makes men tidy. He turned to Mallory. Mr. Price has given us something valuable, not guilt, but method. Mallory exhaled slowly. So the killer knew the shortcut, used it to avoid tracks, then deliberately created tracks. Yes, Poirot said, which means the footprints are not the path of the crime, but its epilogue. A silence fell beneath the lodge, thick with understanding. The murderer, Poirot continued, wanted us to believe in simplicity. One man, one walk, one fate, but simplicity here is manufactured. Mallory's expression hardened. Then the question is, who needed the snow to lie? Poirot's gaze lifted, thoughtful, and for a moment it seemed to rest not on any one person, but on the lodge itself, its corridors, its rooms, its careful warmth. Someone, he said softly, who understands both care and concealment. He turned back toward the stair. And now, Poirot added, we must ask who could move freely between absence and presence, between hidden labor and visible routine, without arousing suspicion. We climbed back toward the warmth of the lodge, leaving the damp planks behind. But I knew, with a certainty as cold as the snow outside, that Poirot had just bridged the most dangerous gap of all, the one between what was missing and what had been deliberately left behind. Chapter 8. Fee the nurse's secret. Helen Morris did not confess all at once. It came in fragments, pauses too long, answers too precise, a carefulness that finally betrayed itself. Poirot noticed it before anyone else, of course. He always did. Where Inspector Mallory heard words, Poirot listened for what strained to remain unsaid. It was after luncheon, served more from habit than appetite, that Poirot asked, very gently, that Helen Morris remained behind. The drawing room had thinned. Lucas Crowley paced near the windows. Margaret Ellison sat rigidly with a book she did not read. Samuel Price had retreated into practical tasks, grateful for motion. Only Helen remained seated when Poirot spoke her name. Mademoiselle Morris, he said, his tone courteous, there is something you have not yet told us. Helen's back straightened. She did not look at Poirot immediately. When she did, her eyes were clear, but guarded. I have answered every question, she said. Yes, Poirot replied, but not every truth answers a question. Some wait to be invited. Inspector Mallory folded his arms. Miss Morris, Poirot believes you withheld information relevant to the night Mr. Crowley died. Helen exhaled slowly. I did not kill him. Poirot inclined his head. I do not believe that you did. Her composure wavered, just slightly. But, Poirot continued, you did give him something. Silence fell. Helen's hands tightened in her lap. Yes, she said at last. I did. Mallory leaned forward. What did you give him? A sedative. She replied, mild, prescribed. I've given it before. Poirot's eyes remained steady. When? After dinner, Helen said. He was agitated, angry. He complained of his heart racing. He asked me to do something useful for once. Mallory frowned. And you complied? Yes, Poirot's voice was calm. What was the dosage? Helen told him. Poirot nodded slowly. That amount, he said, would not render a man unconscious, but it would weaken him. Slow reaction, dull resistance. Helen swallowed. That was the intention, to help him sleep. And did he? Poirot asked. No, she said quietly. Not immediately. He sat by the fire for a long time. Poirot exchanged a brief glance with Mallory. Which explains, he said softly, why the footprints grow shallower, why the stride shortens. Helen looked up sharply. Footprints? Yes, Poirot said. A story written in snow, one you helped author, but did not finish. Mallory's voice hardened. Miss Morris, why did you not tell us this earlier? Helen's composure finally cracked, not dramatically, but enough. Because, she said, it makes me complicit. Complicit in weakness, Poirot corrected gently. Not in murder. Helen laughed once, a short, bitter sound. You don't understand. He owned my silence. Poirot tilted his head. Tell us. She hesitated, then spoke rapidly, as though fearing interruption. 3 years ago, I made an error, a dosage miscalculation. The patient survived, but barely. Crowley was on the board of the private facility. He covered it up, quietly, efficiently. Her eyes filled despite herself, and he never let me forget it. Mallory's expression darkened. Blackmail, yes, Helen said. He reminded me whenever I resisted, when I asked for fair pay, when I asked for rest. And recently, Poirot asked. He said he no longer needed me, Helen replied. That after the holidays he would restructure. He implied that, if I spoke, my past would follow me. Poirot nodded slowly. So you feared him? Yes. And yet, Poirot said, fear does not always lead to murder. Helen shook her head vehemently. I never moved him, never touched him after the sedative. I went to my room. Mallory studied her carefully. Can anyone confirm that? No, she said. I was alone. Poirot did not press her further. Instead, he rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the snow. Covered courtyard. The sedative, he said thoughtfully, is an important piece. It explains much. Explains what? Mallory asked. Why Mr. Crowley could be guided without resistance, why he did not cry out, why the weakening was gradual. Helen's voice trembled. I didn't know. Poirot turned back to her. Number, you did not know how it would end. She looked at him desperately. Then you believe me? Yes, Poirot said simply. Because guilt shouts, yours whispers. Mallory exhaled slowly. So Crowley was sedated, incapacitated, taken outside. Yes, Poirot agreed, but not by you. Helen pressed a hand to her mouth. Then why tell you this at all? Poirot's gaze softened. Because the truth does not belong only to the innocent. It belongs to the whole. He turned to Mallory. Now we understand the faltering steps. But remember, Inspector, the footprints were staged. The weakening was exaggerated, performed. Mallory nodded grimly, which means the killer relied on the sedative, but did not administer it. Yes, Poirot said, they exploited it. Helen stared at him. Then whoever killed him knew what I had given him. Poirot's eyes lifted. Exactly. Mallory's jaw tightened, which narrows it considerably. Poirot turned back to Helen. One more question, mademoiselle. Did anyone know you planned to sedate him that night? She hesitated. He mentioned it, dismissively, after dinner, said I was always trying to drug him into docility. And who was present? Poirot asked. Helen closed her eyes briefly. Margaret Ellison and Lucas. Poirot absorbed this without comment. When Helen was dismissed, She left the room, quietly, as though relieved to have finally set something down. Mallory rubbed his face. So now we have sedation, staging and planks. Yes, Poirot said. 3 layers, each dependent on the other. And the killer? Mallory asked. Poirot looked again toward the courtyard, where snow continued its silent work. The killer, he said softly, is someone who knew Mr. Crowley would be weak and ensured the world believed that weakness was fatal. Mallory studied him. We're close. Yes, Poirot agreed. Very close. The lodge creaked faintly as the wind pressed against it, and somewhere above us a door closed softly. I could not help thinking that the truth, like the cold, had seeped into every room, and that whoever had relied on winter to hide their crime would soon find that even snow cannot keep a secret forever. Chapter 9. Fay Poirot reads the snow. The wind rose sharply as dusk settled over Alderwood Lodge, throwing itself against the windows with sudden fury, as though winter itself objected to what was about to be said. The great hall had been cleared of its casual comforts. Chairs were arranged in a loose semicircle near the hearth, and everyone remaining in the lodge had been summoned there at Poirot's request. No one refused. They gathered with the wary obedience of people who know the moment of uncertainty is ending, and that certainty, whatever its shape, is often worse. Lucas Crowley stood near the mantelpiece, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Samuel Price remained close to the doorway, solid and uneasy, like a man who preferred exits. Margaret Ellison sat upright, composed as ever, her face giving nothing away. Helen Morris stood slightly apart from the others, her posture professional, her expression carefully neutral. Inspector Mallory positioned himself near Poirot, notebook closed now. He had reached the point where listening mattered more than recording. Poirot waited until the wind howled again, rattling the glass, before he spoke. "You hear it?" he asked softly. "The wind. It wishes to be noticed. It wishes to explain itself. Snow, however, is quieter." No one spoke. "Snow," Poirot continued, "does not accuse. It records, and when we learn how to read it properly, it tells us not what happened, but how we were meant to believe it happened." He turned slightly, his gaze resting on the darkened courtyard beyond the windows. "Edmund Crowley did not walk into the snow and perish by chance," Poirot said calmly. "He was taken there, but before that, he was prepared." Lucas shifted, his face tightening. "You all know now," Poirot said, "that Mr. Crowley was sedated. A mild sedative administered earlier in the evening. Enough to weaken him, enough to dull his resistance, not enough to kill." Helen Morris remained very still. "In this state," Poirot went on, "he was vulnerable, confused, suggestible, and crucially, still capable of movement." Poirot turned toward Lucas. "Monsieur Crowley," he said gently, "your uncle trusted you enough to argue with you, enough to believe you would not truly harm him." Lucas swallowed. "I argued with him, that's all." "Yes," Poirot agreed, "but later, when he was sedated, you were asked to help." Lucas stared at him. "Help how?" "By wearing boots that were not yours," Poirot replied quietly. "Boots too large for your stride." Lucas's breath caught. Those boots," Poirot continued, "were used to create the footprints. You were told to walk carefully, slowly, to make them lighter as you went, to suggest weakening." Lucas looked desperately at Mallory. "I didn't know." "I know," Poirot said softly. "You did not know how it would end." Lucas's shoulders sagged. She said he'd just cool off, that it would frighten him. Poirot inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the admission without triumph. "And you, Mr. Price," Poirot said, turning next, "were asked to help in a different way." Price stiffened. "I didn't." "You did," Poirot said gently, "but not with violence. You used the planks, the caretaker's shortcut. You returned unseen. No footprints." Price closed his eyes. She said it was only to avoid panic. That Crowley would be brought back in. Poirot nodded. "You believed her." Price said nothing. He did not need to. Poirot turned back to the group as a whole. "Thus," he said, "we have presence and absence footprints that tell a story, and a return that leaves none. a perfect illusion. He paused, letting the structure of it settle. But illusion alone does not kill. The wind slammed against the lodge again, harder this time, as though impatient. Poirot's gaze shifted at last to Helen Morris. "Mademoiselle Morris," he said quietly, "you are the only one here who truly understands cold." Helen met his eyes steadily. "I am a nurse." "Yes," Poirot said. "You know how long the body can endure. You know how weakness becomes danger. You know precisely how much exposure is fatal, and how much is merely frightening." Mallory's voice was low. "You're accusing her of planning it." "Yes," Poirot said, "of designing it." Helen laughed softly. "That's absurd." Poirot did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You administered the sedative," he said. "You ensured Mr. Crowley would be weak but mobile. You suggested the plan to frighten him, to humble him, to teach him vulnerability. You enlisted help without revealing intent." Helen's composure held, but something in her eyes had hardened. "And you alone," Poirot continued, "knew exactly how long he would survive outside." Helen said nothing. "You knew," Poirot pressed gently, "that if left just long enough, the cold would finish what medicine began, and you knew the storm would delay discovery." Mallory stepped forward. "Miss Morris." Helen raised a hand. "Please." Her voice was calm. Too calm. "You think I wanted him dead?" she asked Poirot. "I think," Poirot replied, "that you wanted him powerless." Helen smiled thinly. "He ruined lives." "Yes," Poirot said, "and you chose to end that power permanently." She looked around the room then, at Lucas, broken with guilt, at Price, pale and shaking, at Margaret Ellison, watching with unreadable eyes. "I calculated," Helen said quietly. "That is true. I knew the limits. I told myself I was letting nature decide." Poirot shook his head. "Number you chose the conditions, nature merely obeyed." Mallory spoke firmly. "Helen Morris, you are under arrest for the murder of Edmund Crowley." Helen did not resist. She straightened her coat, smoothing it as she always had. "I never touched him outside," she said softly. "No," Poirot agreed. "You did not need to." As Mallory moved to take her arm, Helen looked once more at Poirot. "You read the snow," she said. Poirot inclined his head, and the heart. The wind outside fell suddenly, as though exhausted. In the silence that followed, Poirot's voice was very quiet. "Snow remembers," he said, "but it also forgives, when the truth is finally spoken." And in the lodge hall, with winter pressing at every wall, the last illusion fell away. Chapter 10. Fay the Snow Falls Silent. Helen Morris did not scream. She did not collapse theatrically, nor did she protest when Inspector Mallory placed a steady hand upon her arm. What finally broke her was not accusation, but release, the terrible relief of no longer holding the weight of calculation alone. "I didn't push him," she said suddenly, her voice unsteady but clear. "I never pushed him." No one spoke. The lodge seemed to hold its breath. Poirot turned slightly toward her, his expression grave but not unkind. "No," he said, "you guided him." Helen closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the composure she had worn so carefully throughout the night had gone. "He trusted me," she said hoarsely. "That was the worst of it." Mallory waited. Poirot waited. Silence, Poirot knew, was often the most generous invitation. "He was unsteady," Helen continued. "The sedative had taken hold more than I expected. He kept saying the room was too warm, that he needed air. I told him I would help him walk." Lucas Crowley made a broken sound and turned away. "I took him through the service corridor," Helen said. "Samuel had shown me the planks months ago, when he talked about the foundations. I knew how to avoid the snow. I told myself it was only for a moment, that the cold would sober him, humble him." Poirot's voice was very quiet. "But you knew better." "Yes," Helen whispered. "I knew exactly how long." She swallowed hard. He was confused. He thought he was following Lucas. He kept calling his name. That's why the boots mattered, why the footprints had to look right. Lucas covered his face with his hands. I guided Edmund to the courtyard, Helen went on. I left him there. I waited until his speech slowed, until his hands stopped responding properly. Then I went back inside. Mallory's jaw tightened. And the footprints? I made them afterward, Helen said. Carefully. One way only. I pressed lighter as I went. I wanted it to look like weakness, like fate. Poirot nodded once. And when you returned? I used the planks, she said. Samuel helped without knowing why. I went back inside. I dried my boots. I locked the door. Her voice cracked then. Not with fear, but with something closer to horror. I thought, she said, that it would look inevitable. Poirot regarded her steadily. There is no such thing as an inevitable death, he said. Only chosen ones. Helen's shoulders shook. He ruined people. He destroyed them quietly and called it charity. Yes, Poirot replied. And you destroyed him quietly and called it nature. Mallory spoke then firm and measured. Helen Morris, you are under arrest for the murder of Edmund Crowley. Helen did not resist. She nodded once, as though she had expected nothing else. As Mallory led her toward the door, she faltered briefly. The snow, she said softly. I thought it would protect the truth, Poirot answered without raising his voice. Snow protects nothing, it only delays. The door opened cold, rushed in. Fresh snow was already falling, thicker now, softer, eager in its quiet work. As Helen was led out, flakes settled immediately into the courtyard, blurring the sharp edges of the footprints that had caused such certainty. By the time the door closed again, the trail had begun to fade. No one spoke. Lucas stood rigid, grief and guilt tangled together. Samuel Price stared at the floor. Margaret Ellison looked out the window, her expression unreadable, as though she were watching history erase itself. Poirot alone continued to observe the snow. It fell steadily now, layer upon layer, smoothing away deception with the same indifference it had once preserved it. Well, Mallory said quietly at last. That's that. Poirot did not answer immediately. He watched until the last clear trace of the footprints vanished beneath white. Then he turned to me. You see, Hastings, he said softly. Nature is honest. It does not judge. It does not choose. It only responds. And people? I asked. Poirot's eyes were thoughtful. People lie, he said. Even to themselves, especially to themselves. We stood there together as the lodge grew quiet once more. The wind had dropped. The storm had softened. Alderwood Lodge, so carefully restored, so heavily burdened with its past, seemed smaller somehow, emptied of tension, but not of consequence. In winter, Poirot continued, the cold appears impartial, but even the cold can be used calculated, turned into a weapon. He replaced his gloves with deliberate care. And when that happens, he added, the crime is never the weather. It is always the will.